At first glance, the Philippines looks completely chaotic. Thousands of islands. No order, no logic. But that chaos is an illusion. And if you miss the reason why, every map, every destination, every journey feels disconnected. So before we visit the most remarkable places, we'll break down the hidden facts that quietly shape this country. And later, one location will prove why this isn't random at all. To understand why the Philippines looks so scattered, you first need to understand what it's built on. This country sits on one of the most unstable pieces of the planet. The islands rise along the Pacific Ring of Fire, a massive horseshoe-shaped zone where tectonic plates collide. That constant pressure fractures the land, lifts parts of it upward, and pulls other parts apart. Over time, this didn't create one large landmass. It created thousands of separate ones, spread across more than 1,800 kilometers, roughly 1,100 miles, from north to south. That distance alone explains a lot. Climate, language, and even daily routines can shift dramatically over just a few hundred kilometers, about the distance of a short domestic flight. But here's where it gets more interesting. Unlike many island nations, the Philippines was never fully connected. Even during ice ages, when sea levels were lower by up to 120 meters, nearly 400 feet, that meant communities evolved separately for thousands of years, often without regular contact. The result is one of the highest concentrations of cultural diversity on Earth. More than 170 languages are spoken here, not dialects, full languages. And many developed just a few dozen kilometers apart. That separation shaped behavior too. Coastal groups adapted to fishing and trade. Inland communities learned to survive in steep terrain, dense forests, and unpredictable weather. Over time, identity became local rather than national. Even today, many people feel connected first to their island, then to their region, and only later to the country as a whole. But geography didn't just divide people, it also protected them. The islands acted like natural buffers. Storms lose strength as they cross land. Mountain ranges trap rainfall on one side while leaving the other relatively dry. Forests slow erosion. In a region hit by an average of 20 tropical storms every year, that natural fragmentation became a survival advantage. And yet, this same geography creates constant risk. The Philippines experiences thousands of earthquakes annually, most too small to feel, but reminders that nothing here is truly stable. Volcanoes release pressure. Rivers shift course. Coastlines change. Entire communities have had to relocate more than once within a single lifetime. Which raises a quiet but important question. Why do people stay? Part of the answer is adaptability. Filipino culture evolved around uncertainty. Homes are built light, flexible, and easy to rebuild. Social networks are strong because cooperation isn't optional, it's necessary. Extended families spread risk across multiple locations, often across multiple islands. Another part of the answer is the sea. For centuries, water wasn't a barrier here. It was a highway. Traditional boats allowed travel between islands faster than overland movement through jungles and mountains. Trade routes formed naturally, linking distant communities long before modern infrastructure existed. That's also why outside influences arrived early. Long before European ships appeared, traders from Southeast Asia, China, and the Middle East were already exchanging goods, ideas, and beliefs. Later, colonial powers layered new systems on top of existing ones, reshaping religion, architecture, and governance, but never fully erasing what was already there. The result is a culture that feels familiar and foreign at the same time. Daily life blends indigenous traditions with global influences. Festivals mix ancient rituals with modern celebration. Languages borrow words freely. Time itself feels flexible, shaped more by weather and community than by clocks. But perhaps the most overlooked factor is scale. From the air, these islands look small. On the ground, they feel enormous. Mountain ranges rise over 2,900 meters, nearly 9,500 feet, creating cool highland climates just hours from tropical coastlines. Rainforests grow so dense that sunlight barely reaches the ground. Rivers carve deep valleys, isolating villages only a few kilometers apart. This vertical geography compresses multiple worlds into tight spaces. In one day, it's possible to move from humid coastal heat to misty mountain air, a temperature shift of more than 15 degrees Celsius, about 27 degrees Fahrenheit. That diversity fuels biodiversity too. The Philippines ranks among the world's top countries for endemic species, plants and animals found nowhere else. But here's the part most people miss. All of this, the division, the diversity, the adaptability, creates a pattern. Not a neat one, not a symmetrical one, but a pattern built around survival in motion. Nothing here is static. Communities adjust, landscapes change, traditions evolve. And once you see that, the Philippines stops looking chaotic. It starts looking responsive. This is why maps alone don't explain this country, and why simply jumping from one beautiful place to another never tells the full story. Because the locations we're about to explore aren't random highlights. They're responses to geology, to climate, to isolation, and to connection. And as we move through them, one by one, you'll start to notice something quietly repeating beneath the surface. El Nido doesn't announce itself slowly. From the moment you arrive, the landscape feels exaggerated. Steep limestone cliffs rising straight out of the sea, some reaching over 300 meters, nearly 1,000 feet, with barely any beach between rock and water. These formations are made of karst limestone, shaped over millions of years by rain and rising seas. What looks dramatic today was once hidden underground. As sea levels rose, collapsed cave systems flooded, creating narrow lagoons, sharp channels, and enclosed bays that feel almost sealed off from the open ocean. But El Nido isn't just visually striking, it's geographically strategic. The surrounding waters are unusually calm for much of the year, protected by the jagged rock walls. That made this area a natural shelter long before tourism existed. Small fishing communities relied on these lagoons for food, safe anchorage, and predictable tides. Beneath the surface, coral reefs thrive in clear, shallow water, supporting an ecosystem dense enough to feed entire villages within just a few square kilometers, only a couple of square miles. Above water, cliffs host bird species that nest nowhere else in the region. And yet, as contained as this place feels, it's only the beginning. Because once you leave these sheltered waters behind, the landscape opens up, and the story shifts from hidden protection to something far more exposed. Coron feels different the moment you enter its waters. The sea here is deeper, darker, and more enclosed, with steep limestone walls forming natural corridors that funnel boats through narrow passages. Some of these cliffs rise more than 500 meters, around 1,600 feet, straight out of the water, leaving almost no shoreline at all. But what truly sets Coron apart lies beneath the surface. During World War II, several Japanese supply ships were sunk here, settling on the seabed at depths ranging from about 10 to 40 meters, roughly 30 to 130 feet. Above water, freshwater lakes sit trapped inside collapsed limestone formations. One of them reaches depths of more than 40 meters, yet remains completely landlocked, creating a rare mix of saltwater and freshwater ecosystems layered on top of each other. Coron is a place where the past hasn't disappeared. It's been absorbed. And once you leave these enclosed bays behind, the landscape stops rising vertically and instead disappears underground, revealing a very different kind of hidden world. This river flows entirely underground for more than 8 kilometers, about 5 miles, carving its way through solid limestone before finally reaching the sea. Portions of it are navigable by boat, passing through cathedral-sized chambers where stalactites hang from ceilings over 60 meters high, nearly 200 feet. Above ground, dense rainforest filters rainwater before it ever reaches the cave, keeping the system remarkably clear and stable. Bats, swiftlets, and cave-adapted species depend on this balance. Disturb it, and the entire system shifts. For centuries, this hidden route acted as both barrier and protection. It limited access, preserved ecosystems, and quietly shaped settlement patterns around it. But once you emerge back into daylight, the environment changes again, opening outward instead of inward, towards some of the most remote waters in the country. The Balabac Islands sit at the very edge of the Philippines, closer to Borneo than to the country's center. Reaching them already feels like crossing a boundary. These low-lying islands are surrounded by shallow, crystal-clear seas, rarely deeper than 5 to 10 meters, about 15 to 30 feet, allowing sunlight to penetrate straight to the seabed. That light fuels seagrass meadows and coral fields that stretch for kilometers, supporting turtles, rays, and migratory fish. Unlike the towering cliffs seen earlier, Balabac is flat and exposed. There's little shelter from wind or storms, which is why permanent settlements remain small. Life here depends on timing, tides, seasons, and weather patterns dictate when boats move and when they stay still. Historically, these islands marked a transition zone between cultures and trade routes. They were never fully integrated, and that isolation remains visible today in both infrastructure and daily rhythm. Balabac doesn't overwhelm with scale. It unsettles through emptiness. And as the journey continues beyond these quiet shores, the focus shifts away from remoteness toward places shaped not by isolation, but by constant movement and flow. Boracay's reputation often hides what actually makes it interesting. Yes, the beaches are wide and bright, with sand so fine it's often compared to flour. But that texture isn't accidental. The sand here is made mostly of crushed coral and shells, broken down over thousands of years by constant wave action and steady currents moving through a narrow strait. That same geography keeps the water unusually shallow, far from shore. In some areas, you can walk more than 100 meters, roughly 330 feet, before the water reaches chest height. This made Boracay ideal not just for swimming, but historically for small-scale fishing and boat landings long before mass tourism arrived. The island also sits directly in the path of seasonal wind systems. For part of the year, strong trade winds reshape wave patterns completely, transforming calm beaches into prime conditions for sailing and kite-based sports. Boracay is a place that constantly shifts character without changing location. And once you leave an island shaped by constant motion and human traffic, the journey leads to somewhere quieter, where the sea holds a very different kind of secret. Malapascua is small enough to walk across in under an hour. Yet it draws people from across the world for something rarely seen anywhere else. Just offshore, deep underwater drop-offs begin only a few hundred meters from land, roughly a quarter of a mile. These sudden depth changes allow cold, nutrient-rich water to rise toward the surface, attracting marine species that usually remain far below. One of them follows a precise routine. Before sunrise, it ascends from depths exceeding 200 meters, more than 650 feet, to shallow cleaning stations near the reef. The timing is so consistent that locals can predict it almost to the minute. Above water, Malapascua remains grounded in routine. Fishing still dominates daily life, and infrastructure stays deliberately minimal. The island never expanded inland because fresh water is limited, forcing development to remain coastal and compact. Malapascua thrives on balance between deep and shallow, routine and rarity. And after leaving an island defined by what rises from below, the journey continues inland, following water not through the sea, but across rock. Here, water doesn't rush all at once. It arrives in stages. Kawasan Falls is fed by rainwater filtered through limestone hills inland. As it travels underground, minerals dissolve into the flow, giving the water its distinctive turquoise color before it emerges at the surface. The temperature remains cool year-round, averaging about 15 to 18 degrees Celsius, roughly 59 to 64 degrees Fahrenheit, even during the hottest months. Instead of one single drop, the river forms a sequence of cascades. Each level spreads into natural pools, gradually stepping downward through dense forest. This slows erosion and keeps the water clear, allowing fish and aquatic plants to thrive in relatively shallow basins. For local communities, this steady flow mattered. It provided a reliable water source even during dry seasons, supporting settlements upstream and downstream alike. Kawasan is calm, controlled, and predictable. But as the journey continues, predictability gives way to something far less stable, where land itself begins to change shape. Siquijor has long carried a reputation that sets it apart from other islands. For generations, it's been associated with healing rituals, traditional medicine, and practices that blend indigenous belief systems with later religious influences. That reputation didn't come from myth alone, it came from isolation. The island is relatively small, but much of its interior is rugged and forested. For centuries, communities here relied on local plants, tree bark, and roots to treat illness, developing an unusually deep knowledge of herbal medicine. Some of these remedies are still prepared today during specific phases of the lunar cycle, following methods passed down through families. Geologically, Siquijor is built from raised coral limestone. This creates natural terraces and caves, many of which collect fresh water after heavy rains. Springs emerge directly from rock walls, feeding waterfalls that remain active even during dry months, a rare advantage for an island of this size. The coastline tells a different story. Sharp drop-offs close to shore allow reefs to thrive just meters from land, supporting fishing without the need for large boats. Life here evolved to be self-sufficient, inward-looking, and resilient. And as the journey continues inland, the next landscape shifts from belief and tradition to something shaped almost entirely by time and repetition. At first, the chocolate hills look artificial. Hundreds of nearly identical mounds rise from the ground, spread across more than 50 square kilometers, roughly 19 square miles, with no obvious variation in shape or spacing. But their uniformity is the result of erosion, not design. These hills are made of limestone formed under an ancient sea. Over millions of years, rainfall slowly dissolved the surrounding rock, leaving behind cone-shaped remnants that resisted erosion more effectively than the land around them. During the dry season, grass covering the hills turns brown, giving them their name. What makes this landscape unusual isn't just how it looks, but how consistently it repeats. More than 1,200 hills follow the same pattern, creating one of the most distinctive karst formations in the world. For nearby communities, the hills limited large-scale agriculture. Thin soil and uneven terrain forced people to adapt, focusing on small plots, livestock, and trade instead of expansion. The land shaped settlement density and movement, keeping populations dispersed rather than centralized. The Chocolate Hills feel static and permanent, but the journey ahead moves away from land entirely, toward a place defined not by erosion, but by life constantly rebuilding itself. Tubbataha exists far from everything. Located in the middle of the Sulu Sea, it sits more than 150 kilometers, about 93 miles, from the nearest permanent settlement. What rises above the surface are small sand cays. What lies below is massive. The reef system covers nearly 1,000 square kilometers, around 386 square miles, and drops vertically into deep ocean trenches. These sudden depth changes allow nutrients to surge upward, feeding one of the most biologically dense marine ecosystems on the planet. Because there's no freshwater source and no permanent population, Tubbataha avoided the pressures that damaged many coastal reefs elsewhere. Fishing was historically limited by distance alone. Nature enforced protection long before laws did. The result is a rare baseline ecosystem, a glimpse of how coral systems function without constant human interference. Sharks, rays, and migratory species move through predictable paths here, guided by currents rather than coastlines. Tubbataha isn't dramatic because of scale alone. It's important because it shows what happens when life is allowed to organize itself. And as the journey continues, attention shifts back toward land, where isolation gives way to movement, and coastlines start connecting rather than separating. Samar Island Natural Park is one of the least altered landscapes in the Philippines. Covering more than 333,000 hectares, roughly 820,000 acres, it protects one of the country's largest remaining blocks of lowland rainforest. What makes this area remarkable isn't a single landmark, but scale and continuity. The forest canopy stretches for tens of kilometers, dozens of miles, with minimal interruption. Rainfall here is among the highest in the country, feeding hundreds of rivers and underground cave systems that run beneath the limestone bedrock. Many of those caves were used historically as shelters during storms and conflicts, later becoming part of informal trade and movement routes through the interior. Even today, some regions remain accessible only by foot or small riverboats. Biologically, Samar acts as a refuge. Species that disappeared elsewhere survived here simply because access was difficult. The park still supports endemic birds, rare mammals, and plant species adapted to constant humidity and low light. Life developed around endurance rather than expansion. But as dense forest slowly gives way to broken coastlines, the landscape becomes more fragmented, and isolation takes on a very different shape. The Dinagat Islands feel suspended between land and sea. These islands sit on a mineral-rich foundation, shaped by uplifted rock rather than coral, giving them a rugged profile unlike most nearby coastlines. Soils here are thin and metallic, limiting large-scale agriculture. Instead, communities developed along the shore, relying on fishing and small trade routes connecting them to neighboring islands. movement was constant. Staying isolated wasn't an option. Historically, the islands remained lightly populated. Their rough interior discouraged settlement, while their location made them a quiet passageway rather than a destination. Even today, infrastructure remains sparse, reinforcing a sense of in-betweenness. Dinagat isn't defined by density. It's defined by passage. And following those coastal routes northward leads to a place where movement becomes rhythm, shaped not by necessity, but by timing. Siargao's landscape is organized by water and time. Tides, wind patterns, and lunar cycles dictate daily life more than roads or schedules ever could. The island sits along a deep offshore trench, allowing powerful swells to travel unobstructed toward the coast. These waves arrive with remarkable consistency during certain months, shaped by storms forming thousands of kilometers, over 1,000 miles, away in the Pacific. But Siargao isn't only about the ocean. Inland mangrove forests and shallow lagoons act as buffers, absorbing storm surges and stabilizing the coastline. These ecosystems support fisheries that sustained communities long before global attention arrived. Historically, Siargao remained peripheral. Its remoteness delayed large-scale development, preserving traditional fishing practices and seasonal migration patterns. Even today, many residents adjust their routines around surf seasons, tides, and rainfall rather than fixed calendars. The island operates on anticipation, waiting for the right moment, then moving quickly. And as the journey continues, that rhythm gives way to something more compact, an island shaped by fire, water, and constant reinvention. Camiguin is small, but it's built on layers of disruption. The island covers just over 230 square kilometers, about 90 square miles, yet it hosts more volcanoes than towns. At least 7 volcanic centers shaped its terrain, some still classified as potentially active. Eruptions here didn't just alter landscapes, they rewrote daily life. In the late 19th century, one eruption forced entire communities to relocate as farmland vanished under ash and lava. In other areas, land rose from the sea, creating new coastlines and shallow reefs almost overnight. That instability produced something unexpected. Volcanic soil is nutrient-rich, allowing dense vegetation to thrive once activity settles. Freshwater springs heated underground emerge near the coast, creating naturally warm pools where temperatures stay around 38 degrees Celsius, roughly 100 degrees Fahrenheit, year-round. Camiguin learned to coexist with risk. Settlements spread rather than cluster. Agriculture diversified to avoid dependence on a single crop. Memory here is geological. People know which slopes to avoid, which ground to trust. And as the journey continues, volcanic presence shifts from scattered reminders to a single, unmistakable form dominating the horizon. Mayon doesn't need context to be understood. Its symmetry is immediate, a near-perfect cone rising over 2,400 meters, almost 8,000 feet from the surrounding plains. But perfection here comes with a cost. Mayon is one of the most active volcanoes in the Philippines, erupting dozens of times over the past centuries. Lava flows, ash fall, and sudden mud flows, known as lahars, have repeatedly forced evacuations, burying roads and reshaping valleys. Despite that, people keep returning. The reason lies in the soil. Each eruption replenishes nutrients, making the surrounding land some of the most fertile in the region. Farming communities accept cycles of destruction and renewal as part of life, rebuilding in phases rather than permanently abandoning the area. And after a landscape defined by constant alertness, the journey moves toward a place shaped less by natural forces and more by accumulated human decisions. Manila is not a single city. It's an accumulation. What began as a small settlement along a river expanded through trade, colonization, war, and reconstruction. Today, the urban area stretches over 600 square kilometers, roughly 230 square miles, housing more than 13 million people, with millions more moving through it daily. Layers of history overlap here. Pre-colonial trade routes intersect with Spanish-era fortifications. American-era infrastructure runs alongside informal settlements built where space allowed. Every period left something behind, rarely replacing what came before. Manila's location explains its rise. The bay provided shelter for ships, while rivers allowed goods to move inland, That connectivity turned the area into an administrative and economic center long before modern transportation existed. But growth came faster than planning. Neighborhoods adapted independently, creating a patchwork of systems rather than a unified design. Life here depends on navigation, not just of streets, but of timing, opportunity, and density. Manila doesn't resolve the story. It concentrates it. And from that concentration, the journey turns again, away from congestion, toward places where space, history, and landscape begin to stretch outward once more. At a distance, it looks modest, nothing like the towering cones seen elsewhere. But this volcano operates on a completely different scale of complexity. Taal sits inside a massive caldera formed by ancient eruptions. Within that caldera lies a lake, and within that lake sits an island. For decades, that island contained its own crater lake, creating a rare nested system shaped by repeated collapses and explosions. Despite rising only about 311 meters, roughly 1,020 feet above sea level, Taal is one of the most active volcanoes in the country. Its eruptions are often sudden and explosive, driven by magma interacting with water below the surface. Steam, ash, and shock waves can travel far beyond the crater itself. Taal isn't about height, it's about pressure. And once that pressure gives way to calm water and open horizons, the landscape breaks apart into something far more fragmented, yet unexpectedly navigable. Scattered across shallow coastal waters are more than 100 small islands, most no larger than a few football fields. Together, they form a maze rather than a destination. These islands are made of uplifted coral limestone, exposed as sea levels shifted over time. The surrounding water remains shallow, often less than 2 meters, about 6 feet, allowing boats to move easily between islands without deep channels. That accessibility shaped human use. Fishing communities treated the area as shared space rather than territory, moving freely between islands depending on tides, weather, and seasonal fish patterns. No single island dominated, because none needed to. Ecologically, the gaps matter as much as the land. Seagrass beds and sand flats between islands act as nurseries for fish and invertebrates, sustaining coastal livelihoods beyond what the small land area alone would suggest. The result is a landscape designed for movement, not settlement. And after navigating a place defined by fragments and flow, the journey shifts again toward a setting where structure, order, and permanence take center stage. Vigan feels anchored in a way few places do. Its streets follow a rigid grid, lined with stone and brick buildings designed to last, a sharp contrast to the flexible, lightweight structures seen elsewhere in the country. The city developed as a colonial trade hub, positioned between inland resources and maritime routes. Materials like stone and hardwood were used not just for durability, but as statements of control and permanence. Unlike many cities, Vigan avoided widespread destruction during major conflicts, allowing much of its historic layout to survive intact. What makes Vigan distinctive isn't just architecture, it's continuity. The city still functions within its old framework. Homes, shops, and workshops occupy buildings that have been in constant use for generations. Vigan represents a pause in a country defined by motion. And from that pause, the journey begins to rise, leaving ordered streets behind for places shaped by elevation, isolation, and a very different relationship with land. Sagada sits high in the Cordillera Mountains, more than 1,500 meters, nearly 5,000 feet above sea level, where the climate is noticeably cooler and the terrain immediately limits expansion. This isolation shaped everything about how people lived here. For centuries, communities adapted to steep slopes and narrow valleys. Agriculture was small-scale and deliberate. Forests weren't cleared aggressively because erosion would destroy what little arable land existed. Instead, people learned to work with elevation, water flow, and stone. Sagada is best known for burial practices that reflect this geography. Rather than placing the dead underground, coffins were positioned on cliffs or inside caves. Cave systems beneath Sagada extend for kilometers, several miles, carved through limestone by underground rivers. These passages served as shelters, ritual spaces, and natural storage areas during conflict. Sagada is shaped by restraint, by knowing where not to build. And from this highland perspective, the journey continues toward a landscape where restraint turned into precision, engineered not for survival alone, but for continuity across generations. The rice terraces near Banao are often described as ancient, but their true achievement is endurance. Built over 2,000 years ago, they rise step by step along mountain slopes, reaching elevations of up to 1,500 meters, about 5,000 feet, without modern tools or machinery. What makes them work isn't stone or soil alone. It's water control. An intricate irrigation system channels mountain springs across kilometers, several miles, ensuring every terrace receives a steady flow. The system is communal. If one section fails, everything below it suffers. That interdependence shapes social structure, reinforcing cooperation as a necessity rather than a value. Soil here is thin and fragile. Without terraces, rain would wash it away entirely. By slowing water and stabilizing slopes, the terraces turned impossible terrain into productive land, supporting communities generation after generation. The design hasn't changed much because it doesn't need to. It responds perfectly to its environment. But once you step away from land shaped so carefully by human hands, the journey shifts again, toward a place where human presence is minimal, and systems operate almost entirely on their own. Apo Reef lies far from shore, exposed to open ocean conditions that discourage casual access. Covering more than 34 square kilometers, about 13 square miles, it is the largest coral reef system in the Philippines and one of the largest in the world. What defines Apo Reef is scale combined with isolation. The reef rises from deep water, creating steep drop-offs that plunge hundreds of meters, well over 1,000 feet, into the surrounding sea. These vertical walls allow nutrient-rich currents to surge upward, feeding dense coral growth and attracting large marine species. Unlike coastal reefs, Apo avoided constant fishing pressure simply because reaching it required effort, fuel, and timing. That distance acted as protection long before formal conservation existed. Here, ecosystems organize themselves without daily interference. Predator and prey populations remain relatively balanced. Coral structures grow vertically and laterally, forming natural barriers that break waves and slow currents. Apo Reef shows what happens when systems are left intact. And as the journey moves beyond open water, it turns toward the country's farthest edge, where land meets wind and isolation takes on its most visible form.  'Form. 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 ' Located at the northern edge of the Philippines, these islands sit closer to Taiwan than to the country's center, fully exposed to the open Pacific. There's nothing shielding them from wind systems that regularly exceed 100 kilometers per hour, over 60 miles per hour, especially during storm season. That exposure dictated everything. Homes here were never built light or temporary. Instead, stone houses with thick limestone walls, low profiles, and heavy roofs became the norm. Agriculture adapted too. Fields are divided by stone walls to reduce wind damage. After everything shaped by fire, water, jungle, and density, this is where the journey slows. Not because there's nothing left to see, but because here, the logic of the entire country finally settles into focus. By now, the Philippines no longer feels random, not scattered, not chaotic. Each place responds to something: pressure, isolation, water, wind, or time. Different forces, different solutions, but the same underlying logic. From protected lagoons to exposed coastlines, from dense cities to quiet edges, this country isn't held together by geography alone, but by adaptation. And once you see that pattern, you don't just remember the places. You understand why they exist exactly where they are.